The Osborne Internet linked Encyclopedia of Ancient World, starting at page 112. Houses and Homes. The very earliest Egyptian houses were made from wooden posts and bundles of reeds. By the time the country was unified, mud brick was used instead. From then on, everyone, rich or poor, lived in mud brick houses. The difference lay in how big they were, their facilities, and how they were decorated. Kings' palaces were big and luxurious, but poor people's homes could be very cramped indeed. The problem with mud. There was never a shortage of mud in Egypt. The annual Nile flood provided plenty of it, but it also meant that houses had to be built on higher ground. Space was limited, so houses were rebuilt on the same site. As a result, not many original houses have survived, but some foundations have been discovered. Whole workmen's villages have been excavated at Karun, near the Fayum, Dair and Medina, near the Valley of the Kings, and at Tel el Armana, Akhenaten's abandoned city. Workers' cottages. The village at Deir el Medina was founded in 1550 BC for the craftsmen and artists who were building the royal tombs. It thrived for about 500 years. This village has given us a good idea of many people in the New Kingdoms. The village had one long central street running north to south. It was narrow and airless. The houses themselves, built on either side of the street, were long and narrow, and most had four small rooms in them. About 60 families lived in the village at any one time. Townhouses. Because building land in ancient Egypt was so scarce, houses and towns were built tall and close together. Some were up to 4 floors high. The streets below were narrow and crowded. There were no public refuse or sewage system, and each household had to dispose of its own waste in pits, the river, or simply by throwing it into the street. People spent as much time as possible on the roofs to catch the cool breeze and to get away from the smell of the street below. Homes of the rich. Rich people lived in luxurious villas. They had many different rooms and a big hall in the middle for entertaining guests. Both the inside and outside walls were plastered and painted. These villas often had lovely gardens and shady trees and pools. Furniture. Wooden furniture was very expensive, so most houses were very simply furnished. Table, chairs, and beds were usually made from cheap local wood or even reeds. Rich households, though, had furniture made from expensive imported woods such as ebony and cedar inlaid with ivory, precious metals, semi-precious stones, and a kind of glass called faience. Sometimes it was even covered with gold. Houses were lit by small oil-burning lamps. These were simple bowls with linseed oil and a wick, a piece of twisted cloth, inside of them. Women and family life. Egyptian society revolved around the family, and the main role of women was to run the family household and have children. Most did not have jobs or go out to work, but compared with women in other ancient civilizations, women in ancient Egypt had quite a lot of freedom and many of the same rights as men. Women in society. Women did not have completely equal status with men in ancient Egypt, and most ordinary women couldn't read or write. But any woman was entitled to carry out business deals and contracts, own property, or to be a witness in court. Upper and middle class women were generally better educated, and many could read and write. They couldn't hold important jobs such as government posts, but they often helped their husbands with their work. Having a job. Although most women stayed at the home, some did have careers. Noble women could become courtiers or priestesses, while other women could become singers, dancers, musicians, acrobats, and royal court and in the temples. There were also women weavers, gardeners, professional mourners, and even a few doctors. Poor women often worked as servants and nannies for royal or rich families. Sometimes this brought them power and influence. The sons of some royal nannies held important positions at court. If a woman's husband was absent for some reason, this gave her the opportunity to run the family business. Some women ran whole farms. Getting married. Kings had several wives, but most men had only one. Men married at about 20. But girls married earlier, sometimes as young as 14. People's husbands and wives were chosen for them by their parents, usually someone from the same background or the same family. Even so, statues, paintings, and love poems show that they often loved each other very much. Married life. A couple's marriage was a legal settlement made up of a financial arrangement. A husband gave his wife an allowance to live on and run the household, but both husband and wife could own property separately. The couple also set up a joint fund, the husband putting in two-thirds and the wife one-third. This served as a nest egg for their children. If a marriage wasn't a happy one, a couple could get divorced simply by making a statement in front of witnesses. Most people tried to avoid this, though. Relatives of the couple would try to persuade them to resolve their differences. If a divorce was unavoidable, children stayed with the mother, and both parents were free to marry again. The farming life. Farming formed a backbone of Egyptian society. The farmland along the Nile was rich and fertile. So, farmers were able to grow far more than they could eat. Some of the extra grain was paid in taxes to the king, who used it to pay servants, finance building projects, or exported it. The farming calendar was based around the rise and fall of the Nile River. Every spring, rain and melted snow from the mountains of Ethiopia swelled the river. Sometime around July, the Nile overflowed its banks, flooding the whole valley. This was known as the inundation. There's a lot hanging on the level of the floor. If it was too low, there could be poor harvest and famine. If it was too high, it flooded villages and sometimes washed them away. The Egyptians learned how to make the most of the inundation as far back as pre-dynastic times. The land was divided into fields with irrigation canals between them. The government used corvée workers to repair the canal properly every year. People still had to carry water in jars to areas not reached by the inundation, a heavy, time-consuming job. From the New Kingdom onward, lifting the water was made slightly easier by devices called shutoffs. By the end of October, the waters had ebbed away, leaving behind the thick layer of fertile mud called silt. Farmers now had to work the fields and sow the seeds. The major crops were wheat, barley, for making bread and beer. After sowing, a herd of sheep was often driven over the ground so that the seeds were buried and trampled into the soil. Once the crop was ripe, sometime between March and June, everyone piled in to harvest it with the sickles. Sometimes the army was called in to help. It was vital to finish before the summer set in, so that the irrigation ditches could be repaired before the next flood. The grain was loaded onto the donkeys and taken to the threshing floor. Threshing means separating the grain from the stalk, and this was done by cows and donkeys trampling over the crop. When the grain was winnowed, thrown into the air for the wind to blow away the pieces of straw and chaff. Finally, a tenth of the crop had to be handed over to the king in taxes. The peasants usually had to give a portion to their landlord too. Most land was used for crops rather than for grazing animals, but sheep, goats, and pigs could survive anywhere, so all farmers kept a few, along with geese, ducks, and pigeons. Beef was a luxury. Only the rich kept cattle for meat and milk. Although grain was the most common crop, many farmers grew flax for making linen. They also grew a wide range of vegetables and fruits, including beans, lentils, onions, garlic, lettuce, cucumbers, leeks, melons, grapes, pomegranates, dates, and figs. Skilled craftsmen. The craftsmen of ancient Egypt were well-paid, highly respected members of the community. Although the tools and techniques available to them were very simple, the quality of the work was incredibly high, and much of it has survived to amaze us today. Most craftsmen worked for the king on the tomb and temple projects or on the palace and temple finery. Some nobles could afford to have workshops too. Craftsmen increased their income by taking on private work in their spare time. We know a lot about craftsmen's lives from the village of Deir el-Medina, home to the men who built the tombs of the kings, Valley of the Kings. They were wealthier than average craftsmen, with even leisure time to make beautiful tombs for themselves as well as the kings. They also had fun using their skills at home, doodling on ostraka limestone flasks. The craftsmen weren't paid in money, but in grain, fish, vegetables, meat, salt, beer, oil, and occasionally extras such as silver and wine. They were given so much grain that they could trade some of it for other goods. The village was in the desert, so they had people bring in some water when they were also given slave girls to grind their grain. The craftsmen stayed in huts in the valley of the kings while they worked on the tomb. They did an 8-hour day with a long midday break. They had a day off every 10 days. They also had time off for the main religious festivals. The men worked in two groups, one on each side of the tomb, with a foreman in charge of each group. A scribe kept records of materials and tools and the men's attendance and wages. Two other men looked after the storerooms. Wall paintings show that other craftsmen generally worked together in workshops. As in the tomb, the workers were supervised by foremen who made sure that the finished products reached the highest standards, and scribes kept track of everything. The foremen were also in charge of the strict security system, especially when craftsmen worked with gold, silver, and precious stones. A huge range of work was done by craftsmen using many different methods and materials. Here are just a few examples. Carpenters used different woods, local sycamore, fig, and palm wood, as well as imported ebony and cedar to make statues and furniture. Metalsmiths and jewelers worked in copper, bronze, silver, gold, electrum, a mixture of gold and silver, which they hammered into shape. Metalsmiths also made models and statues by casting metal, melting it, and pouring it into stone or pottery shapes. Potters worked with clay or carved pots out of beautiful stone from the desert. Some pots were decorated with a glaze such as a faience, which looked rather like glass. Glassworkers made vessels by making a pot shape out of clay and sand. This shape was then dipped into the bowl of melted glass. When the glass cooled, the clay was scraped out. Jobs for all. There were a number of things that Egyptian society really couldn't do without. These included bread, oil, beer, linen, which everyone wore, and mud bricks, which everyone built their houses with. Making these may not have been the most skilled or respected work, but it kept a lot of people very busy. Whether you were rich or poor in ancient Egypt, bread was an important part of your diet. Loaves came in all different shapes and sizes, and types of flour varied too. Richer people ate white bread, but most people ate a coarser brown version. Sweet pastries were popular, often made into fancy shapes. Breads were made by adding water to flour to make dough. Most of it was made in the home by women and servants. On building projects, though, large amounts of bread were made on the sites for the workers to eat. The most popular drink in Egypt was beer. Grain and bread were soaked in water, then mashed, put through a sieve, and left to ferment. Sometimes things such as spices, dates were added to the beer, then it was sieved again. It was stored in large pottery jars sealed with a clay stopper, but it had to be drunk soon as it went flat quickly. Richer people also drank wine. The grapes were known on the trestles and taken for pressing as soon as they were ripe. Then they were trampled underfoot, and finally the juice was poured into pottery jars to ferment into wine. The reeds that grew along the Nile had many uses. They were chopped, used to make boats and roofs. They were dried and woven to make mats, baskets, chests, and sandals. One special reed called papyrus was also used to make the precious papyrus scrolls used by the scribes. Most building work was done with mud bricks, not stone. Sand and chopped up straw were added to the mud to help bind it. Then this was made into brick shapes, which were left to dry in the sun for a few days. And that was it. The bricks were ready. Before the New Kingdom, there weren't many slaves in Egypt, though rich people had servants to do the chores and wait upon guests. But when Egypt became a powerful empire, many prisoners of war were captured and slavery became very common. Even ordinary people like craftsmen had slaves. Life as a slave varied. If you worked at a quarry or building site, it was tough. But some slaves worked for kind people and were treated well. Some were set free, some even married into local families. The educated few. Although most people couldn't read or write, Egyptian society was based on a written record. So if you could write, you were never short of work. The life of a scribe, a writer, was probably envied by other people. You didn't have to work under the hot sun, and you were highly regarded in society, too. Anyone could pay to go to school, so having an education depended on whether you could afford it. Peasants did their best to educate their sons, as this was the only way to improve their lot in life. Girls from poor families were rarely educated, but in rich families they learned to read and write like boys. There were several kinds of schools. If you were from a noble family, you might be educated in the place with the royal children. Next down there was temple schools. They were village schools too, attached to local shrines. Boys started school age about 5. They learned both the hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts. They spent a lot of time copying and reciting text to perfect their writing and reading skills. To teach younger pupils, teacher used a book called Kemet, which means completion. This was a simple text of model letters, phrases, and expressions, and older students studied more advanced books. These were often classics of Egypt, literature such as the Book of Wisdom, which gave advice to young men about how to behave. Other texts talked about how wonderful it was to be a scribe rather than a craftsman, which must have been given scribes a big sense of their own importance. Once a pupil had mastered the basic arts of reading and writing, he would become a scribe. Many never went beyond this position. If you could afford it, though, you might go on to further studies, which could include mathematics, history, literature, religion, geography, language, surveying, engineering, astronomy, medicine, or accounting. Even if you never progressed from being a scribe, there was always plenty of work to do, composing letters or legal documents such as wills. Marriage and business deals, scribes also copied out the documents in the temple libraries or wrote down questions for the people who wanted to ask a god for advice. There were scribes in every government department. If you were clever and had good connections, you could better yourself. If you kept tax and legal records or worked in a foreign office, you might be able to become an advisor or even, eventually, a minister. The ancient Egyptian writing was written down in 2 ways. The picture writing you see carved on mountains is known as hieroglyphic script. But there was also a simplified version known as hieratic, which was easier and faster to write on papyrus. The Egyptians believed that writing had been given to them by Thoth, the god of wisdom. They called the script Madal Tur, which means the words of the god. They thought that the signs had a magic power on their own and could come to life. Later the Greeks called the script hieroglyphs, which means sacred sculptures. This was because hieroglyphs were usually sculpted onto stone or painted onto the walls of tombs, not written down on papyrus. The hieroglyphic script is a very complex system of more than 700 pictures. Below are some of the simple ways in which they work. Many of the pictures stand for an actual object. When this is the case, there is often a small stroke near it to confirm this. But as well as the object, each picture may represent a sound. It can appear in a word as just this sound and not as the actual object. There are only 25 pictures that represented a single letter sound. NFR equals beautiful. Many of the other signs represent more than one letter and sound, or have many other meanings. Often it was difficult to tell what a word meant for just the letter signs. To another sign was added to the end or the word to show what kind of word it was. These signs are called determinatives. The hieroglyphic letters didn't include vowels, although there were a few semi-vowels, such as the Y. The vowel sounds only appear in the spoken language. This might seem odd, but there are still many languages like this. Modern Arabic is one. In the case of ancient Egyptians, though, we are still not entirely sure how it sounded, so we have to guess at the vowel sounds too. This is why you may see Egyptian words written differently in different books. It takes a long time to learn to read hieroglyphs properly. A good place to start, though, is to learn some of the kings' and queens' names. They are easy to spot because they are written in an oval frame that we call a cartouche. This was where we give protection to the royal name. Hieroglyphs can be read from left to right, right to left, top to bottom. You can tell which way to read from symbols such as a bird, which always face the beginning of the entrance. The heretic script, a kind of shorthand developed in the Old Kingdom, the Greeks gave it this name, which means priestly, because it was most priests who used it. Then during the late period, about 700 BC, a new shorthand developed similar than either heretic or hieroglyphics. Because it was easier to write, this script became known as Demotic, which means the people's. After the fall of Ptolemies, Egyptian culture began to decline as Christianity took over and this the main religion. The Egyptian language began to change because it was difficult to describe Christian beliefs with it. This new Christian language was called Coptic, and Egyptian Christians are called Coptic even today. In fact, the language used in Coptic churches is the closest language in the world to ancient Egyptian. Fasting and fun. The Egyptians loved having fun. This is clear from their tombs, which shows scenes of banquets, making merry, the leisure pursuits such as hunting. These pictures were there to ensure that the dead person had a good time in the afterlife. But they showed the Egyptians knew how to enjoy themselves while they were alive, too. Rich Egyptians would often throw elaborate parties for their friends. They provided huge amounts of meats, vegetables, fruits, not to mention wine and beer. The dining area was decorated with flowers and bowls of fruit, and the best plates and cups were taken out of storage. Guests were welcomed with a garland of flowers and taken to wash their hands in basins filled with scented water. Then they sat down on cushions, stools, and chairs, and they had their first cup of wine. A servant went around the room, placed a small cone of perfumed ointment on everyone's heads. As things got going, the ointment melted and dripped down their wigs, keeping the guests cool and sweet-smelling. Then the feasting began. People didn't do things in moderation. They ate and they drank far too much and thoroughly enjoyed themselves. As well as good wine and food, the best parties always had lively entertainment. As the guests arrived and throughout the meal, musicians, flutes played on harps, lyres, flutes, pipes, and drums. When the food was finished, it was the turn of the singers and storytellers, dancers, acrobats, and jugglers to perform. Relaxing at home. In contrast to their livelier leisure activities, the Egyptians also enjoyed sitting around playing board games. The most common was called senet, a board game played with different pieces. This was played by everyone from the royal family to farmers. The sporting life. Hunting and fishing were vital for many Egyptians, but richer people hunted simply for sport. The most dangerous sport was hunting crocodile and hippos. A team of hunters harpooned the animal, then dragged them ashore with ropes and nets. Mainly, though, noblemen went hunting for birds, accompanied by their servants. They took their pet cats, too, which were trained to flush out the game, and the noblemen used specially shaped throwing sticks, which could easily break a bird's neck. Wild animals provided more sport for noblemen. Those who could afford it went hunting in the desert for hare, fox, antelope, ostrich, and sometimes lions. At first this took place on foot, but in the New Kingdom they usually went on horse-drawn chariots. The hunt served as another excuse to have a party with princes drinking and more fun. All dressed up. The Egyptians went to a lot of trouble over their appearance, but their clothes were simple and didn't change much over the centuries. They did wear plenty of shadowy ornaments, though. Richer people wore fancier clothing and a wide range of accessories, too. Most clothes were made of linen. Rich people wore very thin, fine linen, while ordinary people wore a thicker, coarser cloth. Until the New Kingdom, women wear a simple, tight-fitting ankle-length dress. With two shoulder straps, men wore a kilt made from a piece of linen wrapped around the waist and tucked in. This could be knee or ankle length. In winter, men and women sometimes wore cloaks made from thick linen. Egyptians went barefoot most of the time. They sometimes wore sandals made of papyrus reeds, and nobles had sandals made of richly decorated leather. During the New Kingdom, tunics and cloaks made of very fine pleated linen became fashionable for both men and women. The pleats would have made a fabric hang very elegantly. Women began to wear another garment over their basic tunic, which, as well as having pleats, sometimes made a bright fringe with little ornaments attached to it. Some men had two kilts. A longer one, made for the finest, almost transparent linen, was worn over the basic short tunic. Most men kept their hair very short, while noblemen often had longer hair. They were generally clean shaven. Boys shaved their heads apart from one section that formed a kind of ponytail to one side. This was called the side lock of youth. Women wore their long hair either loose or braided in a variety of styles and decorated it with flowers, pins, and beads. At parties, both men and women wore wigs. Among the rich, these could be amazingly elaborate, especially in later periods, with lots of braids and curls. The wigs also had ornaments hung over them or were decorated with beads and jewels. The best wigs were made of real hair, but they were cheaper ones from black wool. Travel and transport. The Nile River was like a big main road that stretched from one end of the country to the other. The real roads would have been a waste of precious farming land in the Nile Valley, and in any case, the annual flood would have washed them away. So most travel in ancient Egypt happened in boats. Ordinary people didn't travel very much. They only needed to cross the river and go short distances up and down. From the earliest times, they made small boats out of bundles of reeds and went on using these for getting around and fishing throughout ancient Egyptian history. From the Old Kingdom onwards, though, all boats of any size, such as passenger ferries, were made of wood. Sailing north by river was easy because this is the way the Nile flows. Luckily, though, the wind usually blows from the north. This means that with a sail, you can travel south against the flow of the river. So when you see carvings or paintings on Egyptian ships, you can tell which way they're going by whether their sail is up or not. People used the Nile a great deal for getting around, but it was also the place where they relaxed and had fun. For nobles in particular, being on the river in a nice boat was a pleasant way to pass some time. These boats often had a cabin with a canopy in front to shield their passengers from the sun. Hunting birds, crocodiles, hippopotamus were all popular pastimes, and people loved playing around in the water. Groups of boatmen often held competitions where two teams on boats would try to knock each other into the river. The Egyptians depended on the Nile to help them transport goods, and they needed particularly big, strong boats to carry heavy loads. Some of the heaviest loads of all were the blocks of stones used for building projects. For the larger ones, huge barges were used. These barges were too big to be rowed, so they were towed by as many as 27 smaller boats. One of the biggest barges on record was used to transport Hatshepsut's granite obelisk from Aswan to the temples at Karnak. It was estimated to be 270 feet long. Egypt's traders sailed from the Mediterranean coast to other eastern Mediterranean countries and crossed the eastern desert to the Red Sea to reach places such as Punt. Seagoing ships for trading expeditions to the Red Sea were sometimes built along the Nile, dismantled, and carried to the sea, where they were reassembled. They were strong and had plenty of storage space. You can see what they look like on page 62. Although the Egyptians used the Nile whenever possible, overland travel was sometimes unavoidable. Generally, this had to be on foot, though. On journeys across the desert, people had small loads were carried by donkey. For the rich, overland travel was a bit more comfortable. Nobles sometimes traveled in special carrying chairs carried by slaves, or in litters, which were slung between donkeys. Some of them owned horse-drawn chariots.